In this photograph, the lady on the right is Anna Jean Leidheiser Jeffrey. The photo was taken in Nagel's Cash Market that was located on Division/Main Street below the Masonic Temple. Both the Leidheiser and Jeffrey names are of great import when it involves the history of Vermilion. In the early part of 1929 or very late 1928, Dr. Jeffrey, who had come to town 5 years earlier to replace a Dr. Crawford, was hit and killed by a westbound New York Central train at the Adams Street crossing on his way to visit a patient. He left a wife and 3 young sons. In time, Mr. Nageli married Jeffrey's widow. When the boys reached manhood, one, nicknamed Ding, courted and married Anna Jean. Later, Ding, his brother Keith, Doc, and his other brother Bud would own and operate the Park Market in the Fisher Block. Bud eventually returned to the service for a career. Ding went to work at the post office. Doc stayed at the business, Doc's Food Way, with his wife, Belva, until the 1960s, and then went on to hold a variety of positions, mostly for his own amusement. The entire family was, and is extremely personable and popular with townsfolk. This gorgeous photograph blew me quite away. This is the sanctuary of the First Congregational Church when it was located next to Town Hall, in Vermilion about 1900. Today, 2025, the church houses the Millet Auction House and Marketplace. The centerpiece is the new pipe organ. It was donated by Mr. J.C. Gilchrist in memory of his young daughter, Daisy, 3 years prior to the date of the picture. Installed in January of 1897 at a cost of $1,250, a Professor Andrew of the Oberlin Conservatory of Music gave the premiere recital. Just the pure opulence of the sanctuary stuns me. The beautiful lantern chandelier, the ornate woodwork on the table and piano, the wallpaper, and the less than subtle presence of patriotic symbolism just take my breath away. I remember this place rather vividly, but it was not quite this lavish. But so long ago, and so far away, this photograph bridges a century to touch one's heart and soul. For the sake of a name, I use Reese Bard. The barn, here, was actually that of one John Reese, jack of all trades, master of none. Actually, I understate the talents of Mr. Reese. He was a carpenter and a sign maker, among other things. His home on Grand Street, between Ohio and South Streets, is still there. His son-in-law, Ralph Bard, used to live there. As one can see, Mr. Reese also raised pigeons. It was not a hobby. He raised them for profit. Good restaurants paid good money for his game. Rechristened Squab when it got to the table. The barn was long gone before my time, but I remained friends with the family. I often wonder, when I look at the property, that a barn this size could have stood behind the house. While the barn looks to be sizable in the photograph, it really couldn't have been terribly large. I would guess that some folks have storage sheds in their yards much bigger than it. The Reese Bard family has a long and formidable history in Vermilion. The Whitmore family started the Vermilion News Weekly in the latter part of the 19th century. Henry Reese married into that family. They were all exceptionally enterprising people. Long gone from the riverfront between the Lakeshore Electric Bridge and the Vermilion River Bridge, where Romp's Waterport is today, was the Southwest Fishing Company. Owned and operated by Captain Ed Lamp, it was a thriving business when my grandfather, Pearl Roscoe, took this photo. Note the round ice house behind the river buildings. It was a very unusual structure. At some point in time, it burned down. And unfazed by disasters, because he weathered many of them, Big Ed rebuilt and went on with business as usual. This photograph shows workers cutting blocks of ice from the river to be placed on a conveyor and stored in the ice house. Originally, the pic was used as an advertisement in the Vermilion News. This is the reason the lower left corner of it is blank. My grandfather was being creative and had made a collage of sorts for the ad that appeared in print. Those too young to understand why anyone would cut ice from the river to use in the fish house should know that back then the type of refrigeration needed to store the fish was not yet available. Sometimes ice had to be imported to Vermilion from other spots along the Great Lakes in the US and Canada. Time moves along so quickly it's often easy to forget what was where and when it was there. Lee's Boat Yard, just east of McGarvey's restaurant. Vermilion Powerboats today is one of those places. One of the things I seem to recall about the place was that it was sometimes used by the fishermen to dry their nets. I remember the reels they used to clean and dry the gill nets being at this place. I also recall the fields just east of Crystal Beach Park being used for a like purpose. Although in that place I believe the trap nets were just spread across the fields after they had been tarred or retarred. Gene Jackson, Chester's son, clued me in on what these folks were doing with the nets in either place. L.D. Lee was a local entrepreneur. He later became involved in what local people now know as the Shady Lake development on the southeast side of Sunnyside Road, south of Liberty Avenue. Mr. Lee's son, Billy, was once in the Coast Guard and at the time was stationed in Vermilion. He was later involved with a Sandusky radio station. His daughter, Nancy, married Glenn Fulper. She and Glenn used to live on Lee Court in the Shady Lake development. Note the absence of the house next to the Texaco filling station, Huggy's now chart room, in this photo. This may date it into the 1940s. A very creative thought, or word from the past. The obvious thought was that it was the 5th annual convention at Linwood Park. The precise name of the conference is not stated beyond the initials on the flag graphic. But despite that, this is a great picture. This is a vessel of substantial size. It causes one to wonder about the draft of the east side of the stream in the early 20th century. One must also wonder about those on board. The assumption has to be, due to their apparel, that they were passengers and not crew. A further assumption might be that the photograph was staged, not only because all are obviously cognizant of the photographer, but, again, because of their dress. The craft may be of good size, but it is nonetheless a pleasure boat, not a commercial passenger boat. Were someone to slip over the side wearing all those clothes staying above the water for long would be well out of the question. It's hard to say, but this photo may have been taken from what many people have come to know as Cloudy's Ferry Dock. From the angle of the shot and other photographs of Louis Noel's ferry dock, married to the fact that the path to the dock ran from Linwood, this the most likely location of the photographer almost 100 years ago. One of, if not, the oldest public volunteer agencies in Vermilion, Ohio, is the Vermilion Volunteer Fire Department. A loosely formed volunteer force probably existed from the time the village was settled, but existing records show that a volunteer department must have had some formal organization as early as 1860, because they had a hand pumper and a hose cart at that time. It was originally known as Relief Company No. 4. The photograph of the men of the Vermilion Fire Department shown above was taken in Amherst, Ohio, in 1905. Those pictured are, top row, Tony Becker, John Inglebury, Ed Erbscorn, William Shifley, William Inglebury, Al Madison, George Hall. Second row, Kotligs, Fred Berger, Unknown, Bunny Bond, George Christman, John Nagely, Andrew Beekle, Charlie Decker. Bottom row, J. A. Clark, Hank Schmall, Charlie Lang, John Carr, Murray Stevens, Dave Miller, Lee Tischer, John Kropp, and William Dad Tischer. It may interest people to know that to become a member of this force, in early days that a person was required to be a lantern boy for 2 years. That is, they had to carry a lantern or a hand torch at night to light the way for the firemen pulling the hand pumper and or hose carts. Local history buffs who take a close look at the names of these men will recognize many of them for their contributions to Vermilion's commercial and political organization in its infancy. This wonderful picture of the Vermilion Bottling Works is from my friend Dale Holer. The little boy standing in front of the building is one of the very last photos of Vermilion's pop works. The company was established in 1910 and was located in the valley of Columbus Street behind St. Mary's Church. The operation was once owned by the Feldkamp family and was later owned and operated by Dale's good Uncle Larry Shafts. I can't say for a fact, but I believe that the stringent government rules and regulations caused this business to become unmanageable. In recent years, we have seen much the same thing happen to small cider mills in our region. But the long and short of the matter is that Mr. Shafts allowed area fire departments to use this building in a sizable training exercise, and it was burned for that purpose. I was only about 10 years old when this event took place, but I do remember the day. I had a little Kodak Brownie box camera and took some photos of the fire. Those pics still exist, but I have no idea as to where they might be. Numerous bottles from the pop works still exist and are regularly sold on eBay. I have some vague memory of drinking a few bottles of the beverage as a youngster. It was such a great feeling to know that there was a pop works in our town. It was a sad day when it had to end. This picture, sailing on the river, is one of the many Pearl Roscoe photographs I've never before seen. I'm always astounded at how many he took. I'm also astounded at how many appear on the eBay auction block and disappear for obscene prices. I refer to them as obscene because those old postcards may have a great deal of sentimental value, but they are, literally, of no more value than the paper upon which they are printed. This particular photograph appears to have been taken on the river, looking south, toward Kishman's shanties and the old sail loft. It may be that this photo was taken while Roscoe was aboard Cloudy Noel's flat-bottom ferryboat, Gertrude. 'Tis a great picture. The great ship in this photo, moored along the west breakwall, is named Aria. It was the property of Mr. Winton of the Winton Motorcar fame from Lakewood, Ohio. Note the old lighthouse at the end of the pier. This nice photo was taken by my grandfather Pearl Roscoe in 1916. Although the Aria was undoubtedly the subject of this picture, there's a great deal of detail in the photo that is of interest to persons interested in the history of Vermilion. Tom Ball's boathouse to the left. Moored in front is F.W. Wakefield's Tobermory, followed by the Iona. Through an opening between the shanty and the boats, the catwalk to the lighthouse is visible. Also of interest is the composition of the dock. This photo was taken in a spot that would now be near the northern side of the current waterworks looking northeast. This is not a terribly old photograph. It was taken by Vermilionite Jim Smith from atop one of Hull's silos in August of 1965. I'm very glad that Jim took the picture. Again, for the sake of young folks born after that time, this is a great picture of the Maud Elton Hotel sometime before the upper 2 floors were removed. Although the old Roscoe portraits of the building certainly show the hotel in its prime, this affords one a better idea of just how large the building actually was. At the time of this picture, only the basement part of the structure was being used as a saloon. To the lower right, at the back of the old Lakeshore Electric Station building, which at the time of the photo was a bank, there was an electric booster station filled with electrical equipment. Many folks have forgotten about it, but a great picture of the old hotel, whole, but in its last days. Local resident Jim Smith has loaned me some wonderful photographs, including those of the Maud Elton during the last few weeks. This is one of many he has of his uncle, Warren G. Smitty Smith at his bait and tackle business along the Vermilion River. Smitty's place was located where Don Parsons ran his bait place until he retired. Along with his brother, Alfred, Smitty built his business, essentially from the bottom of the river up. Pictures of Alfred are exceptionally rare. He did not like to have it taken. This picture shows Smitty on the right, with his ever-present pipe talking with a friend along the waterfront. Of a later photo, taken of him at the place he kept on Darrow Road, when he was in his late 70s. The pipe is also in that photo. He was truly one of Vermilion's great characters. This, friends, believe it or not, is another very, very, very rare Vermilion historical photograph. There are not, but perhaps, a handful of persons alive who have, or have access to, something like this. And I know only two other persons on this planet who have a copy of this particular picture. Warren, Alfred, and Sterling Smith were all well-known persons and brothers in and around Vermilion, Ohio. Of the three, Alfred was particularly camera-shy, and that is the reason this is a rare photograph. There are few to no pictures of him anywhere. In this particular picture, he was helping his brother, Warren, drive and posts to make a dock along the river, where Parsons Marine is located today, where he opened his old Lakeshore electric car bait store and had his boat livery. I'm guessing, of course, but this was probably during the very late 30s or early 40s. Interurban historian Dennis Lamont indicated to me that sometime in 1938, Warren G. Smith purchased several discarded Lakeshore electric cars with intent to use them for his business. That's how I project the date of this photo. I would like to point out that the Smith family actually goes back in the earliest pioneer days in Vermilion. Charlotte Tuttle Sturgis Austin was an ancestor of this family. This wonderful snapshot of Warren and Alfred was loaned to me by their nephew, Jim. Vermilion entrepreneurs they were for certain. I seriously doubt that Nug Cook, who gave me this photo for the Vermilion Historical Society, will ever imagine how much I've always wanted to see and have a copy of a photo of the old Smith shop that once stood on Liberty next to Walker's Garage, now Vermilion's Ritter Library Annex. Wowie. In my dreams I would see this building, recall walking by and peering inside at the smithy, Fred Becker. I sure wish I had been paying attention because I don't remember when the building disappeared. The auto in the pic is a 1954 Buick, so I assume that this photo was taken about that time. But I suppose my mind was on other matters. This, however, is a real keeper. This photo was taken in 1949 when Fred was 70 years old. By this time, he had been in the blacksmith business for 50 years. But also, by this time, the trade had slackened quite a bit. He'd gone from shoeing to lawnmower sharpening, the old reel push mowers, to repairing plows and making special forged irons. Most his work in 1949 was being done in the summer months. Fred Becker said to a reporter,
"Yep, the automobile is here to stay, and so is the power lawn mower. In fact, the whole darn machine age is catching up with me. It's taken a long time, though."
When asked about how many shoes he'd put on horses during his half-century of smithing, he reportedly answered,
"I don't have any idea. Each horse has 4 feet, you know."
Now here is a great photograph. If you grew up in Vermilion and attended Vermilion schools during the 1950s and 1960s, you most certainly knew this pretty lady. Some of her friends called her Mac. Most of the rest of us knew her as the school nurse. Her name is Violet McIntyre Fisher. Over the last year or so, I've become better acquainted with Mrs. Fisher's oldest son, Jim, as he and his wife, Candy, begin their transition back to town. And during this period, Jim has been gracious enough to give me several books, a map, and he has also loaned me a good share of his experiences, knowledge of things, and of course, some photographs. If I have understood it correctly, this picture of his mother was captured as she stood alongside her airplane. Airplane, you exclaim. Yes, that is correct. The story is that when she was attending nursing school in Cleveland, she commuted, flying from home to Cleveland and back in this aircraft. At that time, I believe her family had a farm somewhere in rural Erie County or Huron County, and she followed the Lakeshore Electric rails to and from school. I don't know about you, but I'm impressed. Could this really be the lady I remember? And here's another great pick I picked up this week, affording all yet another perspective/view of the old Vermilion Lighthouse and walkway. This taken from the Lake Erie shore on the west side of the breakwall that I'd wager to say has been under the lake for some time. Very good sources have told me that Mrs. Wakefield, Dr. Margaret Ruth Reed, who lived in this vicinity, used to pay property tax on that which is now subterranean landscape. Sound absurd? Well, yes. But what else is new? But this is a wonderful view of that area that is, perhaps, circa 1900. Again, great stuff. This, of course, is McGarvey's predecessor, Helfrich's Restaurant, the original boat drive-in. Taken in the 1920s, this pic shows one of the places where the young lovers could rent a canoe or a boat to take upriver. Originally, Helfrich's, as well as a few other places, offered a little bit of everything, i.e., boat rentals, food, and picnic areas. Across the bridge, to the right of this photograph, was the Lakeshore Electric Bridge. It was a very short walk from either the Lakeshore Electric stop for Linwood Park or the station on Liberty and Exchange by the Modelton Hotel to the river. One thing I'd point out at this time is the presence of the automobiles at the restaurant. It marked the beginning of the end for the inter-urban electric trains and the very beginning of personal mobility of America. The mobility revolution of America would forever eradicate the laid-back atmosphere seen in these photographs. Here is a building and a place in Vermilion that some may have never known about, and others have forgot: the Smith Handle Factory. The impetus for getting this photo was Halloween. But don't get the wrong idea. The place isn't haunted. It's just hidden from the common view. From the looks of it, is now used for storage. It isn't in disrepair. In fact, it is a rather tidy place. My assumption is that it was what I've said it was, namely a handle factory. A place where wood handles for shovels and axes were once cut and turned from, perhaps, oak. I have some memory of reading about the concern in the news files, but am at a loss for particulars at the moment. It was never actively engaged in business during my life cycle. I add the name Smith because I've heard the name in that context. I also know that a Smith family lives on State Street in front of it. It seems to me that they do own the property. But without further knowledge, that's about as far as I'll go on the subject of ownership. The old factory gets very little attention from folks because of its location. It is just south of the old nickel plate rail tracks on Route 60 and behind the homes on the west side of the street. One can just see it from the Congregational Church or the school fields across the tracks to the north. This is truly a piece of Vermilion that has, fortunately, been forgotten, but not lost. A few readers have already seen this photograph. Continuing with my everlasting interest in Vermilion's folk hero, Big Ed, Lamp allow me to introduce one of his greatest boat-building achievements, the sandsucker Vermilion. She was over 100 feet in length and was capable of moving 100 tons of sand/gravel. This particular photo may have been taken at the Moe's Boat Yard in Vermilion, although Big Ed also had docks in Lorraine. Captain Lamp is, historically, credited with the discovery of what is now known as the Lorraine Vermilion, also known as the Point Pelee-Lorraine Ridge dredging area, the largest source of commercial sand and gravel in Ohio's Lake Erie waters. Moreover, he was the first to produce sand and gravel from that area. When Big Ed decided that he needed a larger boat to do this work, he took his Vermilion into the Moe's yard, cut her in half, and increased the size of his craft. Some years later, she would be destroyed by fire. In 1941, Ed told my father, Bill Tarrant, that he could be taken out on Lake Erie blindfolded and given a sounding lead, could tell what part of the lake he was in. Born at Catawba Island of Danish parents, his playground was the lake. He built his first sailboat when he was 9 years old and continued building, buying, selling, and operating boats for the remainder of his life. He is undoubtedly one of the most dynamic persons to ever grace the lake and shores of our beautiful Lake Erie. Some photographs just make me happy. This one of Whitmore's Paragon Laundry is one of them. Whitmores are the folks who came to Vermilion toward the end of the 19th century and went into the newspaper business. Their venture was called the Vermilion News. It began in the building in this photo, which was located on the east side of Grand Street, just north of the brick building that once housed Vermilion's library and later the police department. In 2025, the jailhouse bed and breakfast. For those who may not remember this building, it was across the street from the old Vermilion Bailey's hardware store. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore were true entrepreneurs. The Mrs. was a seamstress, and, logically, the laundry business would have been connected. I'm thinking that Vermilion's popular folk artist, Hattie Reese, was a Whitmore. Those familiar with a local gentleman named Ralph Bard may know that Hattie was his mother-in-law. In 1900, Pearl and Bessie Roscoe purchased the newspaper from the Whitmores, and by 1905 had moved the business to a brand new building just across the tracks to the south. This photograph was probably taken at the very beginning of the 20th century. A growing city needs materials to build with, coal with which to heat, and ice to keep things fresh. And this is that which Decker/Inglebury went about doing in the early years of the 20th century. The shack toward the lower left side was used as an office for the business. Beside it, on the south, was a weight deck where wagons/trucks loaded with sand and/or stone could be weighed and then charged for their loads. And some years later, Decker/Inglebury's concern became Hull's coal/building supply. In my lifetime, Mrs. Hull was the person who ran this company, and she did a good job. When the Ford Motor Company located its new plant on Baumhart Road during the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was a great housing boom in town. The fields and vineyards on the very southeast corner of town grew into the Valley View section of Vermilion. These were prosperous times for Hull and all the building trades in the area. One thing of note in this photo is the apparent existence of the Crystal Theater building that can just be seen over the top of the trucks on the west side of Division/Main Street. When this photo was taken, perhaps in the early 1930s, the building no longer housed the theater, but had become a furniture store. Today, as previously indicated, only memories of this business remain. What a wonderful photograph taken by my grandfather, Pearl Roscoe. It shows the old lighthouse and catwalk with sailboats racing into the harbor. Cloudy's first ferry, a flat-bottom boat, named Gertrude, is on the right. When that boat wore out, he had local boat builders, Jim Brooks and George Getz, build a round-bottom strip plank craft he called the Mary Inn in the style of a Big Ed Lamp breed of boats. Ferryman and French-Canadian Cloudy Louis Noel was, in the words of late Vermilion historian George Wakefield, a clown who danced a jig, sang funny ditties, and laughed his way back and forth on the river like a pro. Folks might make a big deal out of Crystal Gardens at the old Crystal Beach amusement park, but it's a good bet they don't know about the Mill Hollow Gardens Dance Hall. This was news to me, but here it is. I don't have anything on this facility. This picture from Brownhelm resident Bill Kutcher is the first I've ever heard of it. But somehow, I don't believe that anyone ever thought that it would have any lasting presence in the hollow. Yet, it did have electricity, and it was of substantial size. The bottom line probably is that it was a great deal of fun, despite the fact that Guy Lombardo and the Dorsey brothers never played there. The Roaring Thirties. In essence, this is a rather mundane photograph until one looks a little closer. The site of the pic is, today, the site of Romps Waterport just south of the Vermilion River Bridge. I won't say that the pic was taken in the 1920s, but if it was very late in that decade, 1929. The folks in the photo have the look of folks from the Roaring Twenties, but some of the automobiles would date later in the decade. And that's why I refer to it as the Roaring Thirties. Behind the cottages and the restrooms, the tracks for the Lakeshore Electric Railroad and the steam railroad trestle are very obvious. This would be very near the site of my favorite Vermilionites, Big Ed Lamps, Southwest Fish Company, and was probably sometime after fire destroyed the place. I've seen other views of the cottages in this location in other photographs. There are a lot of flaws in this particular picture, but I'm glad that Pearl Roscoe took the time to capture it for us. This is a close-up of one of my grandfather's Pearl Roscoe's photographs of the Maud Elton Hotel on Liberty Avenue in Vermilion. I really like my grandfather's pics of the old hotel. They appear on postcards and in other venues all over the proverbial place, but seldom is one given much of an opportunity to look at them closer. So, that's what this picture is about. You have to ask yourself, who were the people in this photograph? What were they doing here? Did Vermilion of circa 1910 have so much to offer travelers that they stayed here for any length of time? This was, obviously, a popular resort. The folks gathered on the porches and steps, and those on the sidewalks certainly appear to be enjoying themselves. I don't know how many people have noticed in the wider views of the hotel that there was a door above the main porch where folks could sit and sun themselves as they watched the world pass by. When I was a youngster, my friends and I climbed up the fire escape at the back of the building and illegally entered the building to explore it. We weren't looking to vandalize it in any way. Whilst I know what we did was wrong, I can't honestly say that I'm sorry that we did it. Some of the things I recall from our visit are that the mattresses were all made of straw and that they still used the old-time wash bowls, etc., on bureaus in the rooms to refresh themselves. There were no individual toilet facilities. All the doors had brass numbers on them. The building, I suppose by necessity, lost its upper stories sometime in the 1960s or early 70s. So, all those things are long gone. But my oh my, what a grand place it must have been. This snap came from the collection of Vermilionite Jim Smith, and it's a real keeper. Looking northeast from Smitty's Bait Shop and Boat Livery, now part of Parsons Marine. Warren G. Smitty Smith's spouse, Emily, and son Robert talk with some customers about to leave the dock for a short trip on the Great Brown River. I've kept this pic intact here, notes and all. The tug in the background is a Parsons boat, the Dawn. Parsons Fish Company was next door. The building across the river is Al Fathar's boathouse and machine shop. Bob Smith, I believe, now lives in St. Louis. He sent me some maps and histories of his family several years ago. What I found interesting was that his family, I know not whether it's through his mother or father, is a relative of the Tuttle, Sturgis, Austin, Pelton families. That's a relationship that goes back as far as the first families that settled along the river. I've been wanting to write some more formal things about the Smith family. I've got some beautiful pics, but I need to know some more about Warren's wife, Emily. There I'm drawing a blank. Somewhere along the proverbial line, someone told me their relationship to Emily, but I don't recall exactly who that was. I know. The first thing to go is the mind. It is a terrible thing to lose. This beautiful picture, donated by Mary Louise Tootie Reisinger, is of Louis Inglebree and Miss Helen Thompson, circa 1900, in front of Louis Haberdashery. It is, to put it mildly, a knockout addition to our photograph collection. It left me breathless. It is one of a kind. The photo on the right, taken in 2005, is in the same place a century or so later. Lewis's haberdashery was located in the building that would later house Vermilion's Liberty Theater. Today it is the art scene. The building to the left of Lewis Place doesn't look the same, but it looks very similar. And the old Vermilion Banking Company building, Wine Vault today, that housed Williams and Williams law firm for so many years, had not yet been built when Mr. Inglebree and Miss Thompson posed to have their shadows frozen in time. The notation on the back of this photograph identifies the building in the background, with the facade, as being C. A. Trinter's insurance office. Today it is Szabo Apparel Company. Roberta Bobby Riley of Santa Maria, California has been emailing me some wonderful pics from her family collection. She is the granddaughter of Elton L. Fisher, whose name formed part of the Maud Elton Hotel. She is the great-granddaughter of George Fisher, who owned the Fisher Lumber Company and built the Fisher Block building. This photo shows the home of George Fisher on Liberty Avenue, where East Exchange Park is now. Bobby's late mother, Virginia, made a notation on the pic that guesstimates that it was taken shortly after it was constructed and that it was probably about 1895. The ladies in the photo are George Fisher's wife Lizzie and their daughter Maud. The house was built next to the lumber yard along the river. One night during the late 1930s, the lumber yard caught fire and burned to the ground. This photo, from Bobby Riley, captures the shadows of the family manse in the early morning light following the fire. This is the best of several that Bobby sent me of that fire. Partially due to the fact that it took place at night, there isn't a plethora of good photographs of this conflagration. And somehow, just somehow, the beautiful house escaped harm. The origin of the fire was never discovered. While Elton rebuilt the business, he located it across the street. What a great photograph. The house is dressed for a patriotic occasion. This house was, in my experience, one of the most pleasant sights in town. It is really a shame that this place was raised for a park. I know not the circumstance of it, but it is too bad. For those unable to place this photo, it is the building adjacent to, but not a part of, today's Vermilion City offices on the southwest corner of Liberty and Main Streets. It is, and always has been, the Masonic Building. The chambers for the local order of Masons and Eastern Star are located on the upper floors of the structure. The lower floors have always been occupied by retail stores. At present, most of what you see, right to left, is occupied by Lee's Landing, is Help Me Tech, and his ancient Celtic shop. When these shadows were captured, the restaurant to the right in the pic was Jack Gray's Shack Lunch. After Jack owned it, Ruth and Norm Duperreau had their restaurant located there. The meat market in the pic was the Star Gardner Market. Jack Gray's Shack Lunch was one of my father's favorite places. My father used to talk about Jack's hamburgers on occasion. My dad and I frequently talked about food and restaurants. Jack's burgers were always served on toast, never on buns. Actually, they are quite good that way. And they were always accompanied by a bottle of beer. Sounds good again, doesn't it? Another unique thing about the place was that it was open all night. One should note that in that era the intersection was quite busy. Routes 6 and 2 ran east and west, and State Route 60 started south at this point. This was a very main transportation hub. In any case, Vermilion was a busy place about the time this pic was taken, likely during the 1930s. And Jack Gray, an Irish immigrant, was a town entrepreneur with a great deal of character. Or was it a great town character who was an entrepreneur? December 25th, 1911. Wow. My brother, Al, gave me a copy of this beautiful photograph, and I didn't even ask for it. Wow. This is the interior of the Star Gardner Market on Division, next to Jack Gray's Lunch Shack. When I was a boy, it was Nagelee Meat Market. But even so, it didn't look like this. This reminds me more of the time I spent in Vietnam, where they also strung their poultry, etc., up on lines in the open air. Note how dark it is in the place. We doth often take for granted how much things have changed over the years. Wow, wow, wow. Here's a wonderful example of a photo that very well could have been, but has not been forever lost. Local resident Dawn Full gave me this pic and a few others because she simply had no great reason to keep them any longer. The young fellow on the small tricycle is her late husband, Ray Full, who was the last owner and operator of the Kishman Fish Company in Vermilion. The snap was captured, to my understanding, alongside his parents' home on Ferry Street. I really find the larger trike to be a fascinating vehicle. Ray is another Vermilion person among many that I know very little about at this time. I remember him as being a dark, handsome fellow, but I never had occasion to speak with him. A very neat photograph. This photo appears here simply because it is an extremely interesting pic. I'd date it circa 1905, and I'd place it in the vicinity of the present-day Vermilion Waterworks on the Vermilion River. The big barn, in the background to the upper left, is Tom Ball's boat shanty, and the buildings across the river in the upper right of the pic is Cloudy Noel's ferry service on the east side of the river. I would further speculate that this is a Sunday afternoon. That's actually a no-brainer. What is not obvious is the reason the tug is docked at this site, unless someone was going to take the ladies for a Sunday excursion on the lake. In any case, this is just a beautiful photograph. Victory Park, historically, really doesn't get much attention. The park is located on Main Street next to St. Mary's Church. This picture of the park is rare to me because it is the first one I've seen which shows the old brick and concrete bandstand that was once located there. I always wondered why no one had taken any pics of it. When I was very young, I used to visit the park to play on the old swings that were stretched between the trees on the south side of the park near Ohio Street, and to play for hours on this bandstand. I have no idea as to the reason it was raised, and I don't remember when that happened. It just disappeared. And although I always kept it in my brain attic beside some musty old memories of the straw mattresses in the abandoned Modelton hotel rooms, it was the only place it existed until I came across this snap. I like the new gazebo bandstand that now stands in this park, but the old one in this picture was more than adequate. Great stuff. Strolling down the north side of Liberty Avenue, circa 1962, looking west. Paul's famous hot dogs. The red and white pole of the barber shop. Rathbun's grocery store. The white and restaurant and Tony's shoe store. Good memories. I would be willing to wager that most folks have forgotten about the lifeguard stand, not to mention the old worn bench, that appear in this 1959 picture taken at Vermilion's Main Street beach. Who remembers the days when Vermilion had a lifeguard at any of the beaches? Who remembers when Tom Rogers and Fred Robles were lifeguards? In any case, Fred Wetzler's snapshots are the type of pictures that can really be invaluable to keeping an adequate record of the history of Vermilion, Ohio. Individuals most likely have numerous old photographs they consider to be unremarkable and, therefore, toss. I would beg that folks not do that. If one has photographs taken around Vermilion during any era, the Vermilion History Museum or Vermilion Historical Society would be more than happy to take them and preserve them. As the saying goes, one man's trash is another man's treasure.